Okay. So, what is music information dynamics? We spoke a lot about the idea that we have to do some kind of an active process for turning our sensations into perceptions. Now, the idea of information dynamics, which has developed unrelated to specific brain models or free energy models, but it still uses some of the same kind of mathematical tool, which is related to complexity in order uh, over time. Now, actually, part of my interest in this broad field of machine learning applied to music is, of course, dealing with time, but then also with the emergence of all of these neural network models and generative models to see if any of these free energy principles could be also translated to the methods of information dynamics that I've been working with. So right now I'm going to present music information dynamics not in the free energy context, although when people speak about Bayesian brain, they talk also about predictive brain. So some of these could be maybe formulated as neural network models, but my work, at least in this respect, the original work was using more of a traditional like Markov models that I mentioned. So I think the underlying concepts that I want to emphasize is that music is considered something like an information source. And it is the same logic that we had in the Bayesian case where we have kind of underlying randomness that generates more and more examples. And Shannon's concept of information is really that there is a probability distribution that generates messages. So I think about music as basically a random number generator that has structure, with whatever the implications of this statement are. And the music listening is sort of a communication process where you take these messages and you have encoder and decoder that go through a channel. The only thing is that the channel is time, okay? So you have your past, and based on the past, you try to receive the next message and kind of decode it or predict it. So decoding and predicting in some senses is very, very similar. And the whole idea of music information dynamics is to measure the change in music in terms of its information contents or change of information or something that I call information rate, but there are additional measures of music information dynamics like predictive information rate. There is also predictive information. So there are several different ways of trying to measure basically how music evolves when you consider music as some kind of a instantiation of an information source. So basically think about music as a random process, and then you can try to see how predictable it is. So the basic concept that I want to just mention here is this idea of mutual information between source and receiver, and I will talk about what it is. And I just want to mention that it kind of relates a little bit to questions of aesthetic measures that some other, it's a very different kind of research area, but people are also trying to define measures for beauty, like Birkhoff and Benz, and they usually play with this idea of some ratios or relations between order and complexity. So we'll have kind of to try to define these models. And again, here there might be slightly different meaning to order and complexity. So I'll talk about this. And the other important part is that in this model of music information dynamics, we think about X and Y. This is basically what is being generated. and here is the past, because the receiver or the listener has already the music, you know, in his availability. So just thinking about maybe a slightly different example of generating something as a random process. So we have seen this hidden Markov model. So this is maybe a slightly different example of what is called a finite state automata, but because you have probabilities, this is actually a Markov model, because you have states and you have transition probabilities. Okay, and you go from state to state, you can state. So this describes a bird song. Actually, people do this. They take bird songs and they create these states, and each state actually corresponds to a specific chirp. But you can see that ah actually has different renderings. So in that sense, ah is a hidden state because what you perceive are the actual sounds, right? So I hope everybody's familiar with spectrogram, right? This is time, this is frequency. So this will be like some kind of a ooh, ooh, kind of like pitch going down. Well, this one will be making ow or whatever, and this is noise. Okay, and I don't know. I'm not the bird, so I'm just kind of showing that this g here and g here are slightly different, but they belong to the same state. And of course, even every moment here could be misclassified as B. So some of the energies or some of the sounds here, right, at this moment in time, have some likelihood of being a B. There is a lot of ambiguity. This is why the states, these balls, belong to a lot. There's a lot of overlap. If you think about these as colored balls, a lot of them overlap. You can have the same kind of waveform actually belong, maybe with smaller probability, to a different chirp. So this is a model, and of course there is a question. Well, why the birds learn these things? I mentioned questions of beauty. For birdsong, people actually investigate sexual selection as a function of birdsong, and apparently there's some preference to birds who can sing very complex songs. Whatever whatever the explanation is, there are also some opposite phenomena, which are a little bit anecdotal in this case, but there is even a claim that on some islands, because there is less sexual selection, the male form more simple songs. So the fact is that there is something about this that actually is being recognized by the listener. So just as a fun example, and I hope this video does play, it's a little long, so maybe I'll skip it, but it's a lot of fun. So it's late night, but I hope it's I don't know how many of you have heard this video. Listen.
Come on, Ollie. Let's do better than this. You know I can be found living all alone. Hanging on around. Oh, please, please, telephone. Don't be cruel. Your heart that's true.
So I'll skip a little bit forward, but
You know, baby, I made you mad. Something I don't want no other love. Baby, it's just you I'm thinking of. Yeah, Ollie. Take it away, Ollie. You know I can't be found living all alone. You can come around. Oh, please, please, telephone. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. To a heart that's true. Yeah, yeah. I said yeah, 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 yeah. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Oh yeah. Let's go one more time, Eddie. You know I can be found.
all right. I'll skip it just because of the time limits, but it's a fun video, and definitely, I mean, there's something, that makes the bird react in a very convincing way. So, speaking about trying to model or analyze sounds with a machine, one model that we've been using, which we call the oracle, basically takes a sound, and I think there was a question. Okay. All right.
Sorry, I had a quick question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh,
Hmm. Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
heard, there was this slide that was the one with the Markov models and the bird song.
Yeah.
In the slide
Uh-huh.
when you showed the spectrogram, what is the so in that one,
Hmm.
how do they calculate the like is there do they calculate a threshold for the variation? Because he talked about how A and B in
Hmm.
the middle of that bar could have been the same. So does that does that have any significance or impact on building that model? Because there's
Right.
some
Hmm.
okay.
No, no. I mean that's an excellent question because the whole uh, you know the whole process, or whether there is uh, a true model here. I mean, how do you decide that these are A's and this is a B? Well, where when they you know possibly overlap. So here maybe at least the segmentation between the vowels exists because it's a bunch of chirps. But yeah, I mean there was some kind of a decision that B is different from A. Now the question is it done by somebody who's annotating this manually, or you run this through something like a hidden Markov model that learns this in some optimal way? Now, usually in hidden Markov models, at least you have to specify how many states you have. And very often you also kind of specify, at least if you think, in this case, if all the states are connected, then maybe the Markov model itself will prune some of the states. And so if you kind of have a good guess about at least the vocabulary of these different sounds, you can kind of create a model and run a lot of these examples, and hopefully it will be able to assign them optimally and give the labels. So Markov model kind of solves this kind of labeling problem as part of once it's being trained, but it can also be trained. Uh, but I think for most of these examples, this was almost constructed by hand, where you basically create this alphabet. You label these because you know, for ornithologists, you're familiar with the chirps, so you already kind of define the vocabulary. But then you look through all of these possible songs and create these graphs that show you the possible sequences or recombinations of these chirps.
So
And
those
people, yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
So
go
those
ahead.
numbers are the probabilities of
Oh, these numbers are probabilities of transitioning.
okay. And
So every time you go through this, you'll create a different sequence.
okay, and then the F it's white because
Oh, I have to look up the paper and see what the F means. Yeah, fortunately, yeah, I don't.
okay, and just one last question. So does this have
Maybe
any
F is maybe no, I don't know. I don't think it's final because S probably is starting state.
because F is the only one that has the one that comes out of it. So that was I didn't know that F
Mm.
had some sort of importance.
Um, I'll have to look up the paper and see what exactly the Fs are. Yeah,
Okay.
because but definitely because goes straight to B, so whenever D, we don't have a D goes to F, something has to happen because before it goes to B. So I don't know what F is, but there is apparently something happening after D that goes to F, and F always is followed by
Goes to
B.
B.
Oh, so this
Oh.
is F. I don't know why it's white,
I thought it
but
was white because there was the probability was one. So that, I thought that was like there was something significant about the F because that's the only one that has a one coming out of it. That was my
um,
interpretation.
pos yeah, I mean possibly. I mean I'm not sure about the coloring scheme, but at least in terms of the meaning of these numbers, that means that F is always followed by B. So whenever you have F, it will be followed by B. There is no other. It cannot jump to any other sequence.
Okay. And the last question was,
Mhm.
is there any, in your research, is there any parallels for this to building phylogenetic models? Because they also, it works around kind of the same principle of one trait being higher or more likely to develop into a different trait. So I don't know if you were aware if this has been applied to cladistics or phylogenetics.
No.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
this is kind of just generic kind of
Okay.
modeling
Okay.
technique. So I'm not sure if this Markov, now phylogenetics, you mean not the sequencing of genes, but how it translates to
Like
properties, right?
the probability of like the traits
Of
leading
the
to it.
traits.
So it's
No,
just okay. I just was curious. Okay. Thank you.
no. Um, so the chirp that we heard before is, I think I had it here somewhere. Right, oops, here. So our task in this project was basically given, let's say, a recording, can you create more variations? I mean, here we don't have such a rich vocabulary, but the idea is, can we basically chop it up into states and create some kind of a automaton like this, or transition scheme between states, just by looking into these examples. So the idea of the audio oracle was that you take a waveform, you analyze this in terms of some features. Okay, in this case, these are L frequency capsule coefficients, but then like for music, many times we just take chroma or some other feature, and then we try to find sequences using so-called factor oracle algorithm, which is a string matching algorithm. And I don't want to like go into these details because they're very specific. I'm just trying to bring this as an example of how we start modeling. So this is not a hidden Markov model. It's another model that we use that actually creates a structure like this by segmenting the recording into states and finding possible transitions. And the synthesis is done by basically chopping up these recordings and overlap add. And you can basically make a random walk on these links that connect basically similar elements. So whenever we had a recording, when we had similar elements appearing, let's say state 18 and state 7 had similar past, they will be connected. State 13 and state, let me see, I'm trying to, 13 and 4 had some kind of a similar past, they will be connected. So it's slightly different technique, but basically what it allows us is now reshuffle or randomize the recording. And we can also decide if we allow this reshuffling to have more of a common past, less of a common past. So this is really a different model than the hidden Markov model, in the sense that it takes into account variable memory, but it's not exactly a hidden state. The hidden here is just the features that we use to extract from the audio. And of course, every state that is linked will have slightly different sound in the original recording. So you can think about this as some sort of a technique to reshuffle, or if you want to say scratch a recording. So if this is a recording, you basically create a graph on top of the recording and you skip a needle. Basically, if you want to play it in a slightly different sequence, you skip a needle from every place in the recording to a different place, but you're limited to skips which are connected by these lines. And this way, you can play it forward, or you can skip back, or maybe you can skip forward, okay? Or you can skip forward and keep playing and then skip here. And this way, you reshuffle the recording, but you always try to maintain some kind of a common past. And this is just a generative model, okay? So and then the question is, if we assume that this is kind of the underlying generative model of the music, can we start now measuring how predictable the next segment is? So the whole idea of information rate is this specific measure that tries to do the following. And here I would need to define, and I think best would be really not to rush through this, but I'll just kind of mention this and then um, uh, we'll can restart next time with more basic definitions. But the idea of information, actually, information as itself has no meaning, and that might be surprising, but information is always relative to something else. And the best example is, like, let's say if you're reading a paper about, let's say, a new vaccine for COVID, okay? If you are, a medical professional, or maybe if you are somebody else who is concerned with specific aspects of, I don't know, economy, or maybe the cost, or maybe some other things, every person will extract slightly different information from the same article. If you're a biologist, you will look at the formulas. If you're somebody else, you might look at the cost. And so there's nothing in a specific piece of data that tells you how much information is in it. It always is relative to something else. And this something else is another random source. So in some sense, the information, there is a collection of possible messages X. There's a collection of possible messages Y. So if X is the newspaper and Y is your knowledge of medical field and very specific questions that you're interested in, you're just looking at what aspect of the messages of X overlap with your field of interest. So information is always relative to something, because the same data can actually have different amount of information for somebody else. So this overlap here is the definition of information, and it's always the overlap or the reduction of uncertainty about, if we have X, and entropy is basically the uncertainty about all possible messages, and Y, in this case, let's say Y is the newspaper. So if you have read the newspaper, okay, then if you know Y, it reduces your uncertainty about X to only this subset, and the difference between them is the information. So in some sense, information is the reduction of uncertainty about one domain, given that you have received a message from another domain. It's kind of a little unusual concept when you hear it first time, but this is kind of what Shannon defined as information, mutual information. You can talk maybe about self-information, that's something else, but self-information becomes entropy, because if you have X and X here, this becomes zero, so that becomes the entropy. But if you think about information in its core definition, it's always mutual information between two things. Okay, so we use this concept where we assume that X is the present or the new material, and Y is the past, and we call this information rate. So it's basically how much information is conveyed about the present given the material that you heard so far. So this is kind of the notion of mutual information. This is the uncertainty about X. This is uncertainty about X given Y. And if you have enough past, it becomes so-called entropy rate. It's just a different term. And basically what we have is how much the past tells about the future. So a little bit maybe more as a teaser, we applied this measure. Of course, the details are important. So what we used capsule coefficients and how we estimate the entropy. But one of the early works was analysis that I've done with also Steve McAdams and on Roger Reynolds' piece. Steve McAdams is psychoacoustician in McGill. And what we try to compare is basically information rate to cognitive reporting of emotional force. So people are listening to Roger's piece, and the blue was the estimate from this equation, and the red was human judgments of emotional force. Basically, it's not exactly emotion in the sense of happy, sad. It's not exactly valence and arousal. It was specific question that Stephen Adams defined, just how emotional you are about this piece without any valence or like positive, negative. And he tried to formulate this. Could maybe it's kind of related to arousal, but it was his own definition. So you can see that somehow the predictability of the data, okay, was related to reported emotional force, although there were some places where there were very different results. But this is kind of was one of the early motivations that there is something you can measure predictability, and it seems to be somehow behaving in ways that are reminiscent or similar to the ways people would react to music, and again, according to very specific criteria. So I think I'll kind of stop here. I mean, the slides cover also some of the music improvisation examples and how we use this for generating music, finding motives. It's a lot of work that I've been doing more as a motivation. And the last thing that I do want to mention is that if you have these models, you can also use them to not only generate new music by random walk, like in the bird song, but you can also try to generate this as a specific trajectory. You want to find a remix or skip that needle in ways that best match another musical example. So this is what we call a query. You basically can take one musical recording, let's say a saxophone recording of some piece, build a random model, and then instead of making it create another randomized melody, you can say, I want to create now a trajectory or walk this model in the way that best matches another musical track, like an accompaniment. So I will kind of just maybe end with this example. What we have here is basically one is a query, another one is the improvisation or generation. We switch between them. So actually what I want to show is, I'll play a short segment of this one, but just so you listen to the saxophone. I mean, here the accompaniment is randomized and the saxophone is the original, but I just want you to listen to the saxophone, because then the same recording of the saxophone will be playing here in response to the accompaniment. Here the accompaniment actually I don't think it works very well, but the solo is the original recording. So. So at least on my headphones, the original recording was on the left side, and on the right was kind of a accompaniment that was generated or randomized to match the recording. But I think the second example is much more convincing. So it used the saxophone to generate a solo for a given accompaniment. So accompaniment was basically the query. It was the fixed thing. And the saxophone was basically was jumping back and forth on the recording you heard before to create a new solo. So this kind of just gives an idea that, you can have a generative model, but it doesn't, in some sense, it can be controlled by something else, okay? So the original saxophone was turned from a long recording into a generative model, basically allowing to be remixed in a certain way. But then you input another stimulus, another observation, and it kind of guides its own imagination or its own randomness, so it will match an input. So you can even think about relation between, voices or improvisation versus some given standard as this kind of a random walk where you have the ability to generate a lot of stuff, but then you basically constrain your variations to something that will match the world and still give you enough randomness. So I think just as a way of thinking, it opens up a lot of possibilities. And the reason I want to kind of talk about all of these somewhat vague ideas or some abstract ideas is that, I mean, they don't have to be realized technologically. If you take this idea and create manually, semi-manually, um, with instructions, or of course, if you want to program something, or somebody wants to take this more formally, less formally, but these ideas of some sort of a form, a structure that has a lot of randomness in it, and then it kind of relates to a different world, either by free walk, wandering and generating some new ideas, or responding to another signal, and that will kind of control that hallucination and create a duet. I mean, these are all kind of, I think, creative musical ideas. And of course, also the question is, your initial structure is also built by looking into a lot of data. So you don't really think about writing these rules. You go out there, you look at the world, and then you kind of like create your simulation of that world. So I kind of wanted to use this accompaniment example of query-guided improvisation as sort of this analogy to controlled hallucination that we've seen maybe last week, where basically there is a network or some mechanism that can imagine things, and then you trigger its imagination by another signal. I think I'll stop the recording and the sharing, and I think we also ran over time.